When a snobby calculus professor tries to embarrass young Prince George in front of the whole class, he thinks it'll be an easy win. But the prince has a secret. He's a math genius. What happens next leaves the professor speechless and the class cheering. Get ready for a twist you won't see coming in this jaw-dropping showdown. Arrogant calculus professor tries to humiliate Prince George. At the Cambridge Mathematical Institute, the best young minds from around the world gather to learn advanced math. In one of the top calculus classes, a boy named George Windsor sits quietly near the middle of the room. He's 11 years old and new to the school. What most people don't know is that he's actually Prince George. Studying without anyone knowing his real identity, he wants a normal school life and hopes to be treated like everyone else. The teacher of the class, Professor Hartwell, is a well-known name in the math world. He is smart, but also harsh. He believes in tough love and often uses embarrassment as a teaching tool. He looks down on students he sees as rich or spoiled. When he sees the name Windsor on the class list, he quickly decides that George must be one of those privileged kids who expect everything to be easy. The other students are all older, most of them teenagers and math geniuses. They know how the professor works. He often picks a student at random and makes them solve a hard problem in front of everyone. Most students dread it. When George gets picked, some students glance at each other and wait for the usual routine. They expect George to struggle, maybe even freeze up. Professor Hartwell gives George a long and complicated problem. It is one of the hardest in his lesson plan, the kind that takes time and focus. He leans back with a smirk, thinking this will be another easy moment to prove his point. But George walks up to the board without any fear. He studies the problem, then begins to write. Slowly but surely, he works through the steps. The room grows quiet. Students start to lean forward. Even the professor's face begins to change. Line by line, George solves the problem with skill and calm confidence. By the time he finishes, the room is silent. Little did Professor Hartwell know, he was about to meet his match in the most unexpected way. The trap he was setting would soon become his own downfall. The trap is set. The big wooden door creaked open as a young boy stepped into the lecture hall. He was late. His hair was a little messy. His tie was loose, and his bag hung off one shoulder. He looked nervous, but tried to stay calm. George Windsor was only 11 years old. He looked smaller than the rest of the class. Most of the other students were at least 15. They were tall, serious, and dressed neatly. As George walked to his seat, a few students turned their heads and whispered to each other. Everyone had heard the rumor. The prince was here, Prince George. Not a look-alike or a cousin, the real one. He gave a small nod to the class and sat down in the middle row. He opened his notebook and tried not to draw too much attention. At the front of the room stood Professor Hartwell. He was tall, with sharp eyes and a firm voice. He stared at George for a moment, then tapped the chalkboard. "Ah," Hartwell said with a dry smile, "our royal guest has arrived. How gracious." A few students laughed quietly. George gave a quick smile and looked down at his notebook. He had been hoping for a quiet start. It was clear that would not happen here. After a moment of silence, Professor Hartwell walked to the front of the class. He placed both hands on the desk and looked out at the students. "Welcome to Advanced Calculus," he said. "This class is not for the weak. You are here because you are the best. But being the best is not enough." He looked around the room, stopping for a moment on George. "Math does not care who you are. It does not care about your last name or where you come from. It is the same for everyone. That is why I teach it. Math is fair. Life is not." His tone became sharper. "Some of you think you are special. You were told this by your parents or your schools. I will break that idea. You will leave this room stronger or not at all." The class sat still. No one moved. Later that day, during the break, two older students sat near George. One leaned over and spoke softly. "He picks someone every year, tries to crush them in front of everyone." The other student added, "He picked you. Be ready. He is not going to go easy on you." George nodded. He understood. He had read about Hartwell. The stories were not kind. Still, he had come to this school to learn and to be pushed. If this was part of it, so be it. When the class returned, Professor Hartwell was already waiting at the front. A large stack of paper sat on his desk. He picked it up and showed it to the class. "This is your first assignment," he said. "Think of it as a filter. Some of you will pass, some of you will not." He handed out the papers one by one. Each student flipped through the pages and their faces slowly changed. These were not normal problems. These were hard. There were questions about limits, functions, and equations that filled the whole page. Some students blinked in confusion. Others sighed. George received a thicker packet than the others. His name was written at the top. Underneath, it said, "Special Assignment." The first question asked him to solve a limit with strange rules tied to the number of royal families over the past 300 years. Another had a graph shaped like a crown. A third used names of kings and queens in a word problem. Hartwell looked straight at George. "Let's see if your private tutors prepared you for this, Your Highness," he said with a cold smile. A few students laughed. George did not. He looked at the page, took a breath, and began to read. He had seen problems like this before. Not with the royal jokes, but the math behind them was familiar. He had been working with high-level tutors since he was 8. He had read university books for fun. As he turned to the next page, he felt calm. The numbers and shapes made sense to him. Professor Hartwell watched from the front of the room. He believed he had set a clever trap, a special set of problems made to confuse and embarrass. He expected George to fail in front of everyone. But George did not look confused. He did not panic. He kept reading, kept thinking. The lines on the paper began to form pictures in his mind. The trap was set, but it would not go the way Hartwell planned. Something was about to change in that room, and it would begin with a single number on a quiet page. The trap was ready, and Professor Hartwell smiled with confidence. But George had a secret that would turn everything upside down and leave the whole class speechless. The calm before the storm? The classroom felt tense. Everyone had the same hard assignment. The students sat quietly, staring at the long pages filled with strange math problems. Some scratched their heads. Others looked confused. A few sighed and gave up after a while. It had only been 2 days since Professor Hartwell handed out the assignment. Many of the students still looked lost. They had tried to solve the questions but kept hitting walls. Some tried again and again. Nothing seemed to work. George sat in the middle of the room, calmly working at his desk. He looked at the same problems but in a different way. He didn't rush. He didn't worry. He just read each question and made careful notes. He did not try to finish them quickly. He read each one fully and thought about what it was really asking. He liked solving puzzles. He didn't get scared by tough problems. He gave each one time. After going through a few pages, George started to notice something. At first, it was small. Then it became clear. Each problem looked different, but they all had something in common. They followed the same idea. The problems were written in different ways. Some used word puzzles. Some had strange shapes and graphs. One even used names of old kings. But deep down, they all used the same math rule. George saw the pattern. He realized that Hartwell had built a trap. He had taken one big idea and changed its shape over and over. George smiled. This wasn't just about solving questions. This was about thinking clearly. This was a game, and he was ready to win. 2 days later, the students came back to class. It was time to show what they had done. The room felt heavy. Most of the students had not finished the full assignment. Some had only done a few questions. Others had tried and failed. Professor Hartwell stood at the front with a list in his hand. He called each student one at a time. They walked up to the board and explained their work. Many had mistakes. Some could not even explain what they tried. Hartwell gave short, harsh replies. "Wrong, not even close. You gave up too early. I thought you would do better." After each student sat down, the room grew more tense. Then Hartwell looked at George. "And now," he said, "our royal mathematician, let us see what the prince has prepared." All eyes turned to George. He stood up, picked up his folder, and walked to the front. He felt nervous, but ready. What happened next would leave the whole class speechless and change everything they thought they knew. The quiet boy in the middle row was about to show everyone what real genius looked like. The moment of truth. George stood at the front of the class, He held his notes in one hand. His other hand rested by his side. He looked calm, but his heart beat a little faster than usual. He was about to speak when Professor Hartwell stepped in. "Do not worry," the professor said with a dry smile. "We will not expect too much from..." George gently lifted his hand. "Excuse me, Professor," he said. "There is a mistake in the question on page 4. The room went silent. Students sat still. Some leaned forward. Others froze with wide eyes." Professor Hartwell stopped mid-sentence. He looked at George, then slowly raised an eyebrow. George opened his folder and turned it to face the professor. He pointed to the problem he meant. "This question says the function is smooth and has no break," George said in a clear voice. "But the graph shows a jump at x equals 0. That means the function breaks at that point. So the question does not match what it says." He spoke softly. His tone was respectful, not rude. Hartwell took the folder and looked at the page. He stared at it for a few long seconds. Then he handed it back to George without a word. "Please go on," the professor said. His voice was quiet this time. George nodded. He walked to the chalkboard and picked up a piece of white chalk. He began to explain. "These problems look different, but they follow the same rule," he said. "Once I saw that, it made the hard parts easier to understand." He wrote down 2 problems from his notes. Then he explained each step slowly. His writing was neat. His numbers and letters were clear. First, he talked about how the limit worked. Then he showed how the same shape appeared in different forms. He pointed to a graph and circled a part that matched another question. "It is the same idea," he said, "just written in a new way." The students watched closely. Some sat up straighter. One girl leaned forward and stared at the board. A boy near the back whispered to his friend, but his voice held surprise, not laughter. George kept going. "This question here looks like a word puzzle," he said, "but if you draw it as a graph, it matches this other one." He drew a second graph and pointed to the curve. "Same shape, same jump at x equals 0. So I used the same steps to solve it." He took his time. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice. The room stayed quiet. The air felt still. George reached the end of the second problem. He stepped back, placed the chalk on the tray, and turned to face the class. "That is how I solved them," he said. He didn't smile. He didn't act proud. He just waited. For a long moment, no one said anything. A few students looked at each other. One nodded. Another gave a small shrug as if to say, "Well, that was pretty good." Professor Hartwell stood still. He looked at the chalkboard. Then he looked at George. He didn't speak right away. Then he gave a short nod. "Thank you," he said. That was all. No jokes, no sharp remarks, no cold smile. Just 2 simple words. George nodded and walked back to his seat. He sat down slowly. He placed his notes on the desk and took a quiet breath. His hands still felt a little warm, but his heart had slowed. All around him, students stayed quiet. Some glanced at him. No one laughed now. The boy they thought would fail had solved the hardest problems. He had explained them clearly. He had even pointed out an error in the question itself. He had done it all with calm focus. No loud voice, no showing off, just good work. Professor Hartwell erased the board without a word. He moved slower than usual. His face stayed serious, but his eyes did not carry the same edge. George sat quietly. He didn't try to meet anyone's eyes. He just opened his notebook and looked down at the last page. He remembered how nervous he had felt before stepping up, but now the fear had passed. He had spoken the truth. He had done the work, and something had changed. He had walked into the class as the prince. Some thought he had come to play the part of a student. Some had waited for him to trip or fail. But now they had seen something else. They had seen a boy who loved math, a boy who solved hard problems by thinking clearly and staying calm. They had seen a classmate who earned his place. In that short moment at the front of the room, George had done more than answer questions. He had earned something no title could give him. He had earned respect, but George wasn't done yet. And what he said next made everyone's jaw drop to the floor. The professor who came to embarrass a student was about to get the shock of his life. The revelation. George stood stood at the board with chalk in hand. He looked at the problem one more time. Then he turned to the class. "There's a small mistake here," he said. "This limit will not work the way it is written." He pointed to the part of the equation where things went wrong. "If we change this piece," he continued, "and fix this part here, we can make the problem work." He began writing on the side of the board. Slowly, he rebuilt the problem from the beginning. At first, the room stayed quiet. Students watched closely. A few looked at their own papers. Others sat still, not wanting to miss anything. George explained each part in a calm voice. He didn't just give the answer. He showed why the steps mattered. One boy near the front leaned forward and whispered, "He's changing the whole thing." George kept going. He wrote a cleaner version of the question. Then he showed how to find the right path to the solution. By the time he finished, the board looked different. The problem had become clearer. The work was easy to follow. The class could see it now. George was not just solving a hard problem, he was showing how to understand it. He was teaching. George turned back to the board and pointed to the finished steps. "This way works," he said, "and it only takes about 10 minutes. The students blinked. Many had spent 2 or 3 hours on that same question. Some had not solved it at all. George looked around the room and gave a small smile. "All the problems follow the same pattern," he said. "So I wrote a formula to help solve them faster." He wrote the formula at the top of the board. It was short and neat. "This works for all the questions on the assignment," he said, "even the ones we haven't talked about yet." He showed how it worked with 2 more examples. Each one matched the formula. The steps were quick and simple. The students were quiet again, but not bored. They were focused. Professor Hartwell stood at the front. He looked at the board. Then he looked at George. He said nothing. Then a single student began clapping. Another joined. Soon the whole class was clapping. George stepped back from the board. He looked a little shy, but he nodded. "My tutors always said," he told the class, "the hardest problems often have simple answers. You just need to look the right way." The students kept clapping. Some smiled. Some looked amazed. Professor Hartwell stayed quiet. He had planned to make George struggle. Instead, he had watched him lead the room. George, only 11 years old, had taken the hardest task in the class and made it look easy. Prince George walked into that classroom as just another student. He walked out as the one who changed everything. The prince didn't ask for respect, he earned it. Want more powerful stories of courage and brains? Follow now for the next chapter in this royal journey of quiet genius and bold heart.